Chapter 20. The middle 6 hours of that day we passed in waiting. The Germans hardly shelled us at all. They had been bombarded to their knees. The obvious thing would have been to attack at once, but it takes a very brilliant general, a Napoleon, to see the obvious. About 3 o'clock, the Gurkhas came alongside us, and we were told an attack on the Aubers Ridge was to be launched. We were to be the first line. Just before 3:30, we fixed bayonets. I was beside Captain Montague, as usual. I think he knew only one thing about himself, that he was fearless and ready to swallow the acid. He kept looking along the lines of men beside him. He scorned the use of a periscope, and stood and poked his head over the parapet. The Germans still seemed stunned. We began to walk forward. Montague and his sergeant major called incessantly, keeping us in line. We had to cross a cratered plowed field to a hedge of poplars, and then across another field lay our objective, a bridge. I suppose we had gone on about half the distance we had to cover, and then we broke into a trot, and some of the men began to shout. The Germans seemed to stop firing altogether. Montague called triumphantly, "On, lads! Victory!" They were the last words he ever spoke. It was a trap. 5 or 6 machine guns scythed us like grass. Montague spun round and fell at my feet. He lay on his back, staring up at me, one eye gone. I collapsed beside him. The air was nothing but bullets. I pressed my face right into the mud. I was urinating, certain that at any moment I should be killed. Someone came beside me. It was the sergeant major. Some of the men were firing back, but blindly, in despair. The sergeant major, I do not know why, began dragging Montague's corpse backwards. Feebly I tried to help. We slipped down into a small crater. The back of Montague's head had been blown away, but his face still wore an idiot's grin, as if he were laughing in his sleep, mouth wide open. A face I have never forgotten. The last smile of a stage of evolution. The firing stopped. Then, like a flock of frightened sheep, everyone who survived began to run back toward the village. I as well. I had lost even the will to be a coward. Many were shot in the back as they ran, and I was one of the few who reached the trench we had started from, unhurt, alive even. We were no sooner there than the shelling began, our own shells. Owing to the bad weather conditions, the artillery were shooting blind, or perhaps still according to some plan established days before. Such irony is not a byproduct of war, but typical of it. A wounded lieutenant was now in command. He crouched beside me with a great gash across his cheek. His eyes burned dully. He was no longer a nice, upright young Englishman, but a Neolithic beast, cornered, uncomprehending, in a sullen rage. Perhaps we all looked like that. The longer one survived, the more unreal it was. More troops came up with us, and a colonel appeared. Aubers Ridge must be captured. We had to have the bridge by nightfall, but I had meanwhile had time to think. I saw that this cataclysm must be an expiation for some barbarous crime of civilization, some terrible human lie. What the lie was, I had too little knowledge of history or science to know then. I know now it was our believing that we were fulfilling some end, serving some plan, that all would come out well in the end because there was some great plan over all, instead of the reality. There is no plan. All is hazard, and the only thing that will preserve us is ourselves. He was silent. I could just make out his face, his staring to sea, as if Neuve-Chapelle was out there, gray mud and hell, visible. We attacked again. I should have liked simply to disobey orders and stay in the trench, but of course cowards were treated as deserters and shot, So I clambered up with the rest when the order came. A sergeant shouted at us to run. Exactly the same thing happened as earlier that afternoon. There was a little firing from the Germans, just enough to bait the trap, but I knew that there were a half-dozen eyes watching down their machine guns. My one hope was that they would be truly German, that is, methodical. We came to within 50 yards of that point. 2 or 3 bullets ricocheted close by. I clasped my heart, dropped my rifle, staggered. Just in front of me I had seen a large shell crater, an old one. I stumbled, fell, and rolled over the edge of it. I heard the cry, "Keep on!" I lay with my feet in a pool of water and waited. A few seconds later, there was the violent unleashing of death I had expected. Someone leapt in the other side of the shell hole. He must have been a Catholic, because he was gabbling Aves. Then there was another scuffle, and I heard him go in a falling of bits of mud. I drew my feet out of the water, but I did not open my eyes until the firing had stopped. I was not alone in that shell hole. Half in, half out of the water opposite me was a grayish mass, a German corpse, long dead, half eaten by rats. Its stomach gaped, and it lay like a woman with a stillborn child beside it, and it smelt, as you can imagine. I stayed in that crater all night. I accustomed myself to the mephitic stench. It grew cold, and I thought I had a fever, but I made up my mind not to move until the battle was over. I was without shame. I even hoped the Germans would overrun our positions, and so allow me to give myself up as a prisoner. Fever. But what I thought was fever was the fire of existence, the passion to exist. I know that now. A delirium vivens. I do not mean to defend myself. All deliria are more or less antisocial, and I speak clinically, not philosophically. But I possessed that night an almost total recall of physical sensations, and these recalls, of even the simplest and least sublime things, a glass of water, the smell of frying bacon, seemed to me to surpass, or at least equal, the memories of the greatest art, the noblest music, even my tenderest moments with Lily. I experienced the very opposite of what the Germans and French metaphysicians of our century have assured us is the truth, that all that is other is hostile to the individual. To me, all that is other seemed exquisite, even that corpse, even the squealing rats. To be able to experience, never mind that it was cold and hunger and nausea, was a miracle. Try to imagine that one day you discover you have a sixth, a till then unimagined new sense, something you comprehended in feeling, seeing, the conventional 5. But a far profounder sense, the source from which all the others spring, the word being no longer passive and descriptive, but active, almost imperative. Before the night was ended, I knew that I had had what religious people would call a conversion. A light in heaven indeed shone on me, for there were constant star shells. But I had no sense of God, only of having leapt a lifetime in one night. He was silent for a moment. I wished there was someone beside me, an Allison, some friend, who could savor and share the living darkness, the stars, the terrace, the voice. But they would have had to pass through all those last months with me. The passion to exist. I forgave myself my failure to die. I am trying to describe to you what happened to me, what I was, not what I should have been, not the rights and wrongs of conscientious objection. I beg you to remember that. Before dawn there was another German bombardment. They attacked at first light, their generals having made exactly the same mistake as ours the day before. They suffered even heavier casualties. They got past my crater and to the trenches we had attacked from, but they were driven back again almost at once. All I knew of this was the noise and the foot of a German soldier. He used my shoulder for a support while he was firing. Night fell again. There was war to the south, but our sector was quiet. The battle was over. Our casualties were some 13,000 killed. 13,000 minds, memories, loves, sensations, worlds, universes. Because the human mind is more than the universe itself, and for all a few 100 yards of useless mud. At midnight I crawled back to the village on my stomach. I was afraid I might be shot by a startled sentry. But the place was manned by corpses, and I was in the middle of a desert of the dead. I found my way down a communication trench. There, too, only silence and corpses. Then a little further on I heard English voices ahead and called out. It was a party of stretcher-bearers passing round for a final ascertaining that only the dead remained. I said I had been knocked out by a shell blast. They did not doubt my story. Stranger things had happened. From them I learnt where what was left of my battalion were. I had no plan, nothing but the instinct of a child to return to its home. But as the Spanish say, a drowning man soon learns to swim. I knew I must be officially dead, that if I ran away at least no one would be running after me. By dawn I was 10 miles behind the lines. I had a little money, and French had always been the lingua franca of my home. I found peasants who sheltered and fed me that next day. The next night I marched again, over the fields, always westwards, across the Artois toward Boulogne. A week later, traveling always like this, like the émigrés in the 1790s, I arrived there. It was full of soldiers and of military police, and I was near despair. Of course, it was impossible to board a returning troop ship without papers. I thought of presenting myself at the docks and saying that my pocket had been picked, but I lacked the impudence to carry it off. Then one day fate was kind to me. She gave me an opportunity to pick pockets myself. I met a soldier from the rifle brigade who was very drunk, and I made him drunker. I caught the leave ship while he, poor man, was still snoring in a room above an estaminet near the station. And then my real troubles began. But I have talked enough.